Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dan Underwood, and I am a professor of political science here at Ferris. It's my pleasure to introduce and to moderate this debate. I do a debate regarding same-sex marriage, the legalization of that, and it's sponsored by the Secular Student Alliance at Ferris, here at Ferris State. Briefly, I'll introduce our participants. This is Mr. Justin Schieber, directly to my right. He is the co-host of Reasonable Doubts, a podcast for the Grand Rapids, Michigan chapter of the Center for Inquiry, and he's participated in numerous debates both in the U.S. and Canada. To his immediate right is David Kallman. He is an attorney in private practice. He's a graduate of Northwood University, a rival university for Ferris. He's in private practice and has been for 33 years in Lansing. And he practices with his son and is also a frequent participant or in debates and public conversations around important issues. The way the debate will be structured is each participant will be given 15 minutes to open, then followed by 5 minutes each of cross-examination, and then 10 minutes each for rebuttal. And after that, will be opened up to a question and answer period for you. And you have blank sheets of paper on your seats to write questions, and there will be people available in the aisles to pick those up and bring them forward and read them. And at that point, each candidate will have up to 5 minutes to respond to those, and there will be an opportunity for each to rebut as well. Okay? Well, thank you very much, and I will introduce Mr. Schieber, who will begin. Thank you.
Well, good evening. First of all, I want to take note of the fact that my opponents and I are straight males, and yet here we are debating same-sex marriage, debating the rights of other people. As persons of privilege, our rights are not at all under threat by these existing bans on same-sex marriage. And I can't hope to sufficiently express the degree to which these bans on same-sex marriage have served to both dehumanize and marginalize gay and lesbian individuals, couples, and families. I can only hope to be sensitive to the fact that these laws bring about real and deeply felt suffering that my opponents and I will never know. And that said, I think that the arguments in support of these laws are as poor as they are dangerous. And when offered the opportunity to demonstrate this, I felt an obligation to do so. And so that's why I'm here. I want to begin by thanking the Secular Student Alliance here at Ferris State University and the Truth Discovery Project for inviting me to participate in this debate. I hope that this will be a stimulating and respectful debate about the civil institution of marriage and same-sex couples. I also want to thank Mr. Kallman for being willing to debate, and of course for all of you for coming out. The question tonight is rather simple. Should the current state of the civil institution of marriage be expanded to include committed same-sex couples? Yes, the debate is about a civil institution. So why is that important to bring up? Well, it's because words sometimes have different meanings. Many times in these discussions, the people involved are unknowingly using the word marriage in two very different ways. And because of this, they can end up talking past each other, and this can be quite confusing. So to avoid that, I think it's important that we kind of briefly touch on the distinction between the two common uses of that word. Sometimes when people use the word marriage, they quite obviously mean religious marriage, right? So given that most people are religious, this tendency makes perfect sense. But religious marriage is a religious sacrament, and it's completely independent of any legal structure here. And so this is seen as a holy promise or commitment. For example, for most contemporary Christians, this is the joining of two individuals, a Christian man and a Christian woman usually, rather than two Buddhists or two atheists. And this is done, it is believed, in the eyes of God. It typically takes place in a house of worship, and it is usually orchestrated by or led by a religious authority of some sort. And contrary to popular belief, this kind of marriage by itself does not bring with it any additional legal rights and responsibilities, though it may bring additional religious rights and responsibilities, and those, of course, would be dependent upon the tradition in which they are being wed. Now, this is important. If some religion has a belief that homosexuality is immoral, they are within their religious rights to deny homosexuals the opportunity to enter into religious sacramental marriage. The first exercise clause of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment of the Constitution guarantees this religious freedom for all of us, the freedom to practice your religion according to its moral doctrine. But let me be clear that that's not what we're debating tonight. We're not debating religious kind of sacramental marriage. Now, the other meaning of the word marriage is civil marriage. So civil marriage is quite different from religious marriage. Unlike religious marriages, civil marriages aren't restricted to marrying only those who adhere to that particular religion. Unlike religious marriage, civil marriage is regulated by laws and requires a marriage license from civil authorities. Unlike religious marriage, civil marriage does bring new legal rights and responsibilities. And it is the civil institution of marriage, that understanding of marriage, that is that issue in tonight's debate. Now, notice that you can have one of those without the other. Now, typically, of course, people get married in both senses at the same time, but that does not mean that they are the same thing. The state doesn't recognize or keep records of who is in a religious sacramental marriage, but it will recognize and keep record of your civil marriage. In the same way, religious institutions do not have to recognize any civil marriages as God-approved sacramental marriages. Right? Nobody here is asking churches or even God himself to recognize that the civil marital status of anybody. Now, I want to turn to some common objections, and I don't know if Mr. Kallman will use these or not, but I think they're common enough to warrant addressing in my opening here. One of the arguments against same-sex marriage is something we can call a religious morality argument. So typically it goes something like this. I'm against marriage being expanded to same-sex couples because according to my religious beliefs, homosexual couples are immoral. But of course, merely allowing a person's legal ability to do something does not mean that you are giving your kind of moral stamp of approval to that activity. For example, most Christians already recognize that just because they respect the legally sanctioned religious freedoms of other religious persons to worship other gods, it does not mean that they're personally giving a kind of moral stamp of approval on those acts of worship. And so the same logic applies, I think. A deep respect for the inclusion of same-sex relationships into the institution of marriage does not mean that one has to give a moral stamp of approval to those same-sex relationships. And so supporting same-sex marriage does not require you to abandon your religiously inspired moral beliefs if among those beliefs is the belief that homosexuality is immoral. Right? It does not require that you abandon that. And so to those who raise the religious morality objection, I think that they're misunderstanding the important distinction between civil marriage and religious marriage, but that they're also failing to take their own religious freedom seriously in any significant way. Another common argument against same-sex marriage is something we can call the argument from redefinition, right? Where if we expand marriage rights to same-sex couples, that this fundamentally redefines marriage and that this is somehow a bad decision. This is somehow negative and something we should be avoiding. Well, first of all, I'm not suggesting that we fundamentally redefine marriage here. I'm suggesting a very slight and reasonable expansion of that important institution. Secondly, civil institutions are supposed to be malleable. And that's for a very good reason. We must allow for necessary changes to these institutions as we learn more about the factors which are relevant to the principal aim of those institutions. And if we fail to adapt and mature our institutions to better fit our growing understanding of civil life and liberty, then we undermine its ability to serve the purpose for which it was created. The American story is, of course, thick with adjustments, or, as people might argue, redefinitions of our institutions. And here I'm speaking of the emancipation of slaves in the American South, the civil rights movement, or of women's suffrage. And we all see those expansions as a matter of national pride, and rightly so. And finally, I think that this argument presumes that marriage, at least as a social institution, hasn't already been redefined over and over and over again throughout history. Stephanie Kuntz, author of Marriage: A History, writes, quote, "What traditional marriage had in common was that it really was not about the relationship between a man and a woman. It was a way of getting in-laws, of making alliances, and of expanding the family labor force." Let's not also forget that polygamy was an extremely common form of traditional marriage. The point, of course, here is that marriage has changed dramatically in the past, and the slight expansion that same-sex couples are asking for today is it pales in comparison to the changes that have already been made. My last objection is probably the most common one here. It argues that children are better off when they have a mother and a father than they are when they are raised by same-sex couples. And that therefore this is an argument, it is argued that this is an argument for preserving marriage to be between the kind of what they would argue is an ideal circumstance for raising a child. But even if it is true that children raised by same-sex couples are disadvantaged by same-sex parents, the question I want to ask is that true? Is that actually the case? Well, in his expert testimony for the Snyder v. DeBoer case here in Michigan, psychologist David Brodzinski testified that, quote, "Every major professional organization in this country whose focus is the health and well-being of children and families has reviewed the data on outcomes for children raised by lesbian and gay couples, including the methods by which the data were collected, and have concluded that these children are not disadvantaged compared to children raised in heterosexual parent households." But even if it was true, let's assume that it was true for the sake of the argument. This is actually just a big distraction, because neither the desire nor the potential or ability to bear and or raise children, biological or otherwise, is a necessary condition for persons to enter into civil marriage, and it never has been. If you were completely sterile and you had a tattoo covering your entire body describing your hatred for children and your disinterest in raising any, you could still get married. A committed gay couple is no different than a sterile but committed heterosexual couple. Yet the proponents of bans on same-sex marriage want to treat these couples differently. Why is that? Well, so far I've shown that extending support for expanding civil marriage to include same-sex couples is perfectly consistent with both a positive and negative moral attitude toward homosexuality itself. And so the religious morality argument, I think, is a failure. I've also argued that the argument from redefinition and the argument from a concern for children are flawed beyond repair for a host of different reasons. I do not know, again, if my opponent will use these arguments, but I did, of course, want to address them because they do seem to be the most common objections to this view. But of course, it's one thing to show flaws in another position's arguments, and quite another to provide an argument yourself. So what is my argument? What are the reasons for expanding civil marriage to include same-sex couples? It's actually quite a simple argument. Premise one. If civil marriage is good for individuals, relationships, and society at large, the opportunity to enter into civil marriage should be extended to same-sex relationships. Premise two, civil marriage is good for individuals, relationships, and society at large. Therefore, the opportunity to enter into civil marriage should be extended to same-sex couples. Journalist Jonathan Rauch correctly points out that civil marriage is a contract that two people make as a couple with their community. Essentially, what they're doing is they're committing themselves to take care of each other as best they can so that the state or community doesn't have to. Obviously, this is why marriage is such a value to the state. Jonathan writes, "This is a fantastically fruitful bargain. Marriage makes you, on average, healthier, happier, and wealthier. If you are a couple raising kids, marrying is likely to make them healthier, happier, and wealthier too. Marriage is our first and best line of defense against financial, medical, and emotional meltdown. It provides domesticity and a safe harbor for sex. It stabilizes communities by formalizing responsibilities and creating kin networks, and its absence can be calamitous. And because it so strongly encourages lifelong commitment, marriage is incredibly good for society. Allowing gay marriage would just be adding to that goodness." To review, I've argued that the typical arguments for gay marriage are flawed beyond repair. I've also argued that the argument for gay marriage is just that it furthers the purpose for which the civil institution exists. That is, to stabilize society, to be an overall force for good. If we care about the stability of families, if we want to encourage a genuine pursuit of happiness for all members of our society, then it's about time we recognize that these are not mere lifestyles. These are relationships. It's about time we start encouraging deep commitments and to take care of each other. Because that's what's best for those individuals. That's what's best for those relationships. And that's what's best for our society. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. This is on? All right. Well, I'd also like to thank the Secular Student Alliance and those involved in putting this on tonight. I think it's a really good idea to have these issues, there you go, thank you, brought forth and have people thinking about it and talking about it. It's been good to get to know Justin a little bit. We've just met through this process here, and I appreciate his graciousness and his civility through the whole thing and through this process. And I think that's the first thing I wanted to mention tonight is that, unfortunately, it seems on both sides of this issue a lot of times civility is lost. And it seems that we can no longer agree to disagree. And it's important that we have these discussions in our society, not just on this issue, but on many different issues. And to do so in such a way where it's not demonizing or going after the other side as just being hateful or despicable people, whichever side of this you're on. And unfortunately, it's happening on both sides. To support upholding traditional marriage does not make one opposed or hateful toward anybody. It's just support for an institution that has been around for thousands of years, and it's something that I believe benefits society, and we're going to talk about that here. Part of this, too, is your worldview. Where do you come from? How do you assess issues like this? It's an important thing for you to think about. And I just bring it up briefly to talk about that you really need to think through, what is your worldview? Do you believe in truth, or do you believe things are malleable? Do you believe that there is a standard, or that it's just kind of, relative? Something might be true for you and not for somebody else, that sort of thing. You really need to think those things through for yourself, because it's hard to, in our society, especially today, to assess these issues without coming to some conclusions in your own mind on these issues. We all live as if there is truth, don't we? We live that way. You may not want to accept it. How many of us have said at one time or another, well, that's not fair, or that's wrong? Well, what is that an appeal to? That's an appeal to some standard. It's an appeal to some truth somewhere that you feel is being violated because something's not fair. So you need to think that through. Where you start from matters, and we need to have this discussion. Part of that, too, is treating everybody with respect. And I know that is probably one of the most important things that qualifies anybody to actually be heard. and to have a good conversation on this is to treat everybody with respect. And tolerance. Tolerance doesn't mean you have to agree with the other side. It's just you're willing to listen and be open-minded and agree that, well, maybe something I'm thinking may be wrong, and I need to take a look at that. As Lincoln said, with malice toward none and charity for all. And he went on to give the Gettysburg Address. And this is the approach I choose to take. And I think it's clear Justin's taking the same approach, and I appreciate that very much. Now, I'll tell you briefly my underpinnings here. I'm not going to try to hide any. I'm Christian. I believe in traditional marriage. It's not my purpose to hide that from anybody. That's my worldview. That's where I will be coming from in these discussions here tonight. I believe that marriage is between one man and one woman. And it's not simply a Christian ideal. The Muslim faith believes this. Jewish, Christian, many, many other faiths believe this. Jesus clearly taught it in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. You can look that up for yourself. This view of marriage has been followed by most cultures throughout all recorded history. And yes, there have been some variations on that, but it's always been a man and a woman. I don't want to get into polygamy and other things like that. I think we could probably have a whole debate on that, Justin, if we wanted to. But look, this viewpoint and where I'm coming from is not the focus of my discussion tonight. And I raise it just to give context so that you understand where people of faith are coming from in this issue. And it's a position of being for something, for traditional values, for traditional understanding of marriage. And there are good public policy reasons for maintaining that, separate and apart from any religious tradition. So what's the first question? Really it is, what is marriage? And Justin started to address that. A lot of my comments tonight, if you're interested in reading further on this, there was an article published in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, volume 34, that was entitled, What is Marriage? And then a subsequent book was written by the gentleman that wrote that legal article. Webster's dictionary defines marriage as a social institution under which a man and a woman establish their decision to live as husband and wife by legal commitments and religious ceremonies. I appreciate and I find interesting Justin's argument about the distinction between civil and religious ceremonies. In reality, I don't see the distinction. And the definition in Webster's doesn't see the distinction. It's by legal commitments and religious ceremonies. It can be one or the other, but it is both also. Today we have essentially two competing views on marriage. We have a traditional view, as I've already stated. Some people refer to it as a conjugal view, but basically marriage is one man, one woman. Make a permanent, exclusive commitment to each other of the type that is naturally fulfilled in bearing and raising children and the commitment to each other. Now, obviously, that's the ideal. Is that carried out in our society all the time? Obviously not. The divorce rates and everything else, unwed parents, all of those things come into play. But that's the traditional view. It includes the ideals of monogamy and fidelity. This link to the welfare of children does explain why marriage is important to all. And it's important for the common good and welfare of society. So that's the traditional view. The second view is what I refer to as revisionist view. And this is that marriage is the union of two people, whether of the same sex or opposite sex, who commit to romantically loving and caring for each other and to sharing the burdens and benefits of a life together. So it's based on romantic love. Not that there's anything wrong with that, to paraphrase the old Seinfeld show. But that's the premise and the understanding for this revisionist view, is that all it needs is two people romantically caring and loving each other. It's a union of hearts and minds enhanced by whatever forms of sexual intimacy that those partners agree. This idea of romantic marriage is chosen. It's determined and defined by the couple that enters into it. So the claim that this traditional view of marriage is based solely on religious beliefs is really not accurate. it coincides with religious belief. But there are religious beliefs that don't support, especially today, this traditional view. Rather, the religious traditions have been shaped by our common history as human beings. This has been a natural institution throughout recorded history, way before there was Christianity, before there was Islam, anything like this. The social practice of marriage can be discerned by our common human reason, regardless of our religious background. And the reasons to then uphold it can be asserted without appealing directly to religious or moral claims. Now again, as I said, I know where I'm coming from, but that's not the thrust of my argument here tonight. The revisionist view says anyone has the right to marry another based on their love for each other. However, think about that. That is objectively not true. I mean, think about it. There is no general right to marry the person that you love. If this means that you have a right to have any type of relationship that you desire to be recognized as marriage. And I understand the efforts to minimize, say this is just a small little change, it's just same-sex couples. No, this will be a wholesale change of the definition of marriage, and it will not be limited to same-sex couples. The obvious problem here comes then, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line if same-sex couples are now considered under the umbrella of marriage? And let me preface all this too by saying, this doesn't mean that there can't be legal remedies and things in place for couples who come that aren't married in the traditional marriage sense to have protections for property and estate and medical and other things. Those things can easily be done. So where do you draw the line? Under the revisionist model, any joining of persons in love is sufficient for the marriage, and therefore, under that definition, you can see where it goes way beyond just same-sex marriage. All other types of groupings of individuals also have equal standing to be approved under such a standard. So let me quickly say, what is a marriage? Again, that's the general question here. Marriage is always traditionally included at least 3 points. First, a comprehensive union of spouses, a man and a woman, becoming one in a bodily union as only a man and woman can. And if you're a Christian or a religious person and you believe in creation, we were created that way. Secondly, a special link to the welfare of children, as has already been discussed. And I will agree with Justin, there is disputes right now, a big dispute in the social science area as to the impact on children being raised in same-sex households versus those with a mother and father. I would say it's intuitively clear that having both a mother and father provides the optimal situation for a child. Both bring different things to the table for children. But there is social science findings that make this clear. The left-leaning Research Institute Child Trends said this: research clearly demonstrates the family structure matters for children, and the family structure helps children the most is a family headed by 2 biological parents in a low-conflict marriage, and that goes on from there. So they have made that finding. That article in the Harvard Journal that I mentioned also has a lot of references to a lot of social science. But again, to be fair, there is social science studies the other way. This is an area that's in flux. I would simply say we should not make such a huge social change when even the competing interests in this field right now disagree. Thirdly, there are societal norms that are supported by traditional marriage. A permanence, monogamy benefits to the state and the culture. Marriages are a matter of urgent public interest. Strong society rely on strong families and strong marriages to produce what the state needs but can't do itself, which is productive citizens, children who grow up to be productive citizens. The more you have broken families, and this is same-sex couples versus and even heterosexual couples, the more of a burden that puts on society. The more money that has to be spent for social services. There's a greater cost to government through this process. So The bottom line here is that these three areas are public policy issues that support upholding traditional marriage. There's nothing wrong with arguing against a proposed policy based on anticipated unwanted consequences. This will lead, if same-sex marriage is approved, it will lead to the recognition of any type of union. All protestations to the side. That is what it will lead to. Gloria Steinem, Cornel West, many others are already arguing on the same premise that's being put forth here for same-sex marriage, that multiple partner sexual relationships should be approved. NAMBLA, I'm sure you're familiar with that group, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, believes adults should be able to have sex with children, and seriously believe that and think that that's something that's positive. So those are some of the reasons to support traditional marriage. Now, the second question, real briefly here, for your consideration is who decides this? Who decides this issue? The people or the courts? Because right now, same-sex marriage is only being fought through the court system. Why? Because the same-sex proponents are losing in the field of public opinion. They are losing at the ballot box. 30 states right now to date have voted constitutionally to define marriage as between one man and one woman, the traditional form, including Michigan. So because they cannot win in those arenas, they are now trying to get one judge in a federal court or a panel of judges to rule and overturn literally millions of voters who have voted the opposite way. Fundamental change in society is better cultivated through the ballot process, not through the courts. I think that's an important issue that also needs to be looked at. Each state should be allowed to determine their own standards on this issue, not an unelected judge or a court. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to commend both participants on very impressive opening remarks. We will now begin the cross-examine portion of the debate, and we will begin with Mr. Schieber, who will have 5 minutes, and followed by Mr. Kallman, who will have 5 minutes, and then after that we will have a rebuttal. Thank you.
Are we just using the podium then? Oh, go ahead, grab your mic. Okay. Okay, ready? Okay, so I consider myself pro-traditional marriage as well, but I don't see how that's inconsistent with also being pro-marriage for other types of marriage. So I guess I'm wondering, why do you think that being pro-traditional marriage is somehow inconsistent with also being pro-same-sex marriage?
Well, again, I think it's because it essentially defines marriage. Go ahead.
Oh, please go forward.
Okay. I think it makes the definition of marriage meaningless at that point. It makes marriage mean anything, whatever any 2 people or 10 people decide it means. And so that is not something that I think is good for our society. And secondly, again, there are these public policy reasons and things that have traditionally been shown to be the best in our society and for our culture to keep thriving and moving forward. And that if you allow these other types of unions and way beyond just same-sex unions, that undermines that, and so I don't believe that that's good for society either.
Okay, so your response is that it's not good for society. So I guess regardless of whether or not we do eventually legalize same-sex marriage in a broad way, do you think that same-sex couples will ever stop being couples? Do you think that they will ever stop being gay, or do you think that they will ever stop raising the children that they already are raising? Because wouldn't it be a good idea, it seems, if marriage is a stabilizing force for families, wouldn't that be a good idea in the interest of the children being raised currently? Because it's not as though if we continue the bans that they're going to stop raising the children that they currently are.
No, of course not. And obviously right now, gay couples can adopt and they can have children through other means, and they are raising children. Again, the point here is what is best, and I believe the social science studies and the things that I reviewed make it clear having both a mother and father is best for children. But beyond that, too, you've got a situation here where we are taking a cultural norm, a societal standard that has been in place literally for thousands of years, and a short time span here of, literally just a relatively few years, saying that, well, now we know better, and now just because a couple people love each other, now we're going to totally upend and undo this cultural norm. I don't think that's something we should do cavalierly or without serious review.
Yeah, so traditionally, I'm sure you're aware, there was a thick Aristotelian thread of thought going on that said that we should keep the races separate because God put them on different continents, He made their colors different for a reason, and that they should not be mixed. And of course, this is one of the many justifications, or I should say one of the few justifications for disallowing interracial marriage. That's a traditional argument, right? It seems like they moved forward to that. Do you think that they moved forward in allowing this too fast?
Well, I always find this argument about interracial marriage to be, I don't understand it, frankly. I mean, the whole argument on interracial marriage was still involving one man and one woman. And as I said, I'm a Christian. I don't see anything in the Bible where God set separate colors in order that people should be in separate divisions and all those sorts of things that justifies racism at all. I understand some people use their religious faith to justify that, but that doesn't mean it's there or that it was appropriate. I think that decision was totally appropriate in the Loving case back in 1967. The U.S. Supreme Court said interracial marriage between a man and a woman is improper. Why? Because it's racial discrimination, not because it was anything to do with same-sex marriage or anything else. So,
sure,
that dealt with...
The point of my argument there was that this appeal to tradition is quite obviously an illegitimate appeal, right? So I'm wondering if you have other... Well, we could talk about slavery too, right? What I'm saying here is, of course, the fact that something has existed and has led to stability for society, maybe because, slavery was good for economic reasons, right? But of course, morally, it's reprehensible, right? So appeal to tradition and historical how things have been doesn't seem to me like an adequate justification for keeping an entire section of the population out of some basic moral rights here.
Dan, I'm not sure what you were showing us there. We have
5 minutes remaining for this segment, and then each of you will have an individual rebuttal.
Well, again, let me just answer that question.
Right?
Yeah, but let me answer your question, Justin. I think that's a good question. Again, slavery obviously cannot be justified on any level whatsoever. That's why you have the 14th Amendment. That's why you have equal protection of the law. That's why you have these protections that have been built and put in place. Obviously, I'm not arguing that society can't evolve and move forward and change, when things come along. But I don't equate this issue with slavery or racial discrimination. It's just not the same thing. And LGBT individuals are not, and I'm saying this as an attorney, they are not a suspect class. They are not provided protection like civil rights gave to African Americans and other minorities. They are two totally different. I know that gets into a whole, we probably have a whole debate on that issue, for a couple hours, I'm sure. But it's two totally separate things. LGBT folks are not a suspect class, and so it's not the same thing. So I guess I don't see the argument there. But let me just ask a couple questions. One of the things that I find interesting from the same-sex proponents is that they're not satisfied with simply being recognized or being allowed to be married or to do whatever, but they feel they have to take it to the next step and force other individuals to participate or be involved in their marriage or their activities, whether it's a business or whatever. What do you feel about that? Do you think somebody of faith should a pastor be forced to do a same-sex marriage?
I would say two things. First, I think that the way that question is being phrased is a bit loaded. Secondly, I think it's entirely irrelevant to the question of tonight's debate.
Okay. Well, all right. Let me find my notes here. Hang on just a second. I appreciate the distinction that you're trying to make between civil institution of marriage versus a religious marriage. But you do agree, I mean, if somebody gets married in a church, but they don't follow the laws of the state of Michigan, and they aren't married, they don't get a marriage license or anything else, then in the eyes of the law, they're not married, correct?
That's entirely my point, yeah. That they would be married in a religious sense at that point, right?
Right, but they would be no better off than a same-sex couple then, because they're not married in the eyes of the law.
Right, because religious marriage doesn't bring any additional legal ways and responsibility.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we're on the same path there. What is your position on the status of the social science and the studies? Because I think you would agree there are studies that go both ways on these issues, especially in the impact on children. Do you think we should maybe go a little slower and let's see how things play out before making wholesale changes in our society?
I think that if one recognizes that the broad consensus within the psychological community is that there is no significant difference, then I think that it would be an error to say that this is a legitimate debate within the social science community. I think that you can find a few cases here and there, but if you look at the methodologies, there's some very severe problems there. But, I mean, again, we're talking about, I think the DeBoer case referred to over 150 studies that demonstrate that there's no significant difference. So calling this a legitimate debate within the social science community is like calling evolution a legitimate debate among biologists or calling climate change a legitimate debate among people who actually are experts in that field.
Well, that would make another good debate for climate change, I'm sure. I think I would disagree, though. If you read the Sixth Circuit's opinion in the DeBoer case that's now on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, there was testimony from social scientists with the same credentials that opposed the gentleman that you referred to, David Brzezinski, I think it was. And they have scores of studies and reports. I mean, I just did a little bit of research before coming today, and I found dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of studies that would support this viewpoint also. And, you know, both sides make the same claim. I'm not a social scientist. Both sides make the same claims of improper parameters. You know, they didn't have the proper things put in place to make it a valid study. That's my point. You know,
I'm not saying that all the studies on the side that I'm advocating here are perfectly well-designed studies. But what I'm saying is that when you factor in just the broad swath of the studies that are pointing in that one direction, then those few studies that are potentially problematic. I mean, what you need to do is you need to look at the expert consensus. Like I said, you can always find individuals that are experts in the field that hold a minority view. You can find that within any field. But to appeal to those to try and make your point is to make an inductively incorrect argument in authority.
Well, and I would argue there that it's not so one-sided as you're presenting it to be. But I think we're at the end of our time there, so I know you have your 10 minutes. So
okay. For rebuttals then?
Yeah, each 10 minutes for rebuttals.
Okay. So Mr. Kallman expressed some skepticism about my distinction between religious marriage and civil marriage. And I guess I just want to review what I meant there. And we discussed it briefly here, but what I'm talking about here is that you can have a religious community that largely sets themselves apart, like lives in the mountains, for example, right? And they have their traditions, they have their sacraments, they have their marriages, and they can go about those and they can discriminate in whatever way they choose according to the moral doctrine of that particular church, right? The debate is not about that kind of marriage. And as I said, most of the time, because most people are religious in this country, that most of the time when people do get married, it's that they're getting religiously married and civilly married at the exact same time, right? They're signing the civil paperwork, but they're also, making a promise in front of their faith community, right? So again, those things can happen at the same time, but I think it's quite important to maintain that there is a distinction there. Mainly that religious marriage, they do not bring with them any additional legal rights or responsibilities, right? So you need to go through the necessary civil institution to gain those benefits. So Mr. Kallman also argued that marriage is best within the context of a man and a woman, and that I think is a problem. So again, as I've argued, the social science, I think, is pretty one-sided on this issue. Again, I mean, obviously the state's defending the bans on same-sex marriage. They need expert testimony, so they're going to go look for experts that share their view. There's a handful of persons that are willing to defend this in front of the courts. And I would argue that if you actually read the testimonies, it's a rather humiliating exchange when it comes to scrutinizing their methodologies. One second here. So if what we want out of marriage is, as Kallman argues, the ideal framework for raising children, which I think is quite obviously false, because you can get married when you have no interest in having children. You can get married when you are completely sterile. So that just that seems like a kind of invented reason here. But let's say that was the principal aim for marriage, right? Let's kind of play with this fiction. Let's say that the ideal setting for raising children is what we're after. The problem is that just gender diversity within the couple raising the children is not the only factor and it's not even the most significant factor when talking about the well-being and success of that child as they move throughout their life. One of the most significant factors is, of course, the income of their families, right? Whether they're lower class, whether they're higher class. So it seems to me that if we want to take this kind of this view about marriage being we should only preserve the ideal form of it to raise children, it seems like we should then, if we're going to be consistent with our logic, limit marriage to those higher class or higher income couples that have the resources to raise their children, that have abundant resources so that they're never stressing about money. And if you look at the social science, that is one of the biggest factors in predicting a child's well-being. So again, I really don't think we want to make an appeal to the ideal relationship when it comes to raising children, unless we want to say that poor people are no longer allowed to get married. So again, my point here, my general argument here, is that marriage is a good thing. That traditional marriage is a good thing, and that other kinds of marriage are good things as well. Same-sex marriage. And that there's no legitimate reason here. We talked about the historical argument, that marriage has always been this way. That, to me, seems like quite obviously a bad argument. There's a lot of things that have just been this way for a while. It's not a good argument to say that this is how we should design our social policy, right? We know that there are groups that have been historically discriminated against. And to say that the homosexual community is not a suspect class is something that astonishes me. So again, my basic argument here is that marriage is a good thing. And in their book, The Case for Marriage, Why Married People Are Happier, Healthier, and Better Off Financially by Linda Walt and Maggie Gallagher, who are both proponents of traditional marriage. They agree that the strong relationship between marriage and mortality has been observed across numerous societies and among various social and demographic groups. In countries as diverse as Japan and the Netherlands, the unmarried die off much faster and sooner than the married. In most developed countries, men of any given age who are single, divorced, or widowed are about twice as likely to die as unmarried men, and unmarried women face risks 1.5 times as great as married women. And despite the fashionable tendency to regard marriage as an institution of declining usefulness, the health gap between the married and the non-married in developed countries is growing rather than narrowing. So I think that Mr. Kallman and I can agree on a central point to this debate, which is that having the government encourage commitment between persons is a good thing. Again, it isolates them from, it isolates the government from having to, they're less likely to have to require government assistance because, again, they're able to help each other. They're their first line of defense against, as Roush had pointed out earlier, financial problems, psychological problems. All these things are hugely important for the stability of a society. And I just think that that's quite an obvious reason. I think that this argument really boils down to that. If marriage is a good thing, why can't we have more people getting married? And it seems to me that, or my time is just about done, isn't it? Okay. All right.
Thank you. Regarding the whole issue about LGBT folks not being a suspect class and all of that, please understand my argument there. I'm not saying that there hasn't been discrimination against LGBT folks. Of course there has, and it's regrettable and it should never happen. But under the law, when I'm talking about a suspect class, it's talking about a class where the courts give a higher level of scrutiny because of lengthy and long-term discrimination. The Loving case, I always find that an interesting name for the case, Loving, versus, I think, West Virginia or Virginia. That was a case that dealt with interracial marriage, and again struck down the illegal racial classification. They could not have interracial marriages. But again, it was still one man, one woman. It didn't change the definition of marriage. It just simply said who is allowed to marry. And states put restrictions on who is allowed to marry. Can a brother marry a sister? No. Can a son marry a mother? Can first cousins marry? Well, in a few states maybe. Okay. But states, there's all kinds of restrictions on who can marry. And the Loving case dealt with a category that was a suspect class because the category had nothing to do with genetics and problems that could occur with those types of relationships. We filed a brief. I also work with the Great Lakes Justice Center, which is a nonprofit legal organization in the Lansing area. And I helped start that with Professor William Wagner and some others. And we filed a brief in this case that's pending before the Supreme Court right now. And if you're interested, you can go online and find it. It's at our website. I've got some cards up here if you want them afterwards. We filed that brief on behalf of a national coalition of African American pastors who strongly object to this characterization that LGBT folks have been discriminated against in the same manner as they have been. And I think it's very clear they have not. If you look at the historic and widespread terrible discrimination that has occurred in our country in prior centuries and even up through today, I think you could look at you could see the difference, and we argue this in our brief. These disgraces that pertain to black Americans are unmatched. No other class of individuals, including those who are same-sex attracted, have ever been enslaved. They've never been lawfully viewed as not human, 3/5 of a person under the Constitution. Viewed as property, that's never happened. same-sex couples have never, or individuals have never lawfully been forced to attend a different school, to walk on a separate public sidewalk, to sit at the back of the bus, to drink at separate drinking fountains, have been denied their right to assemble, or denied their voting rights, for goodness sake. I mean, I can go on, and this is the brief we just filed in pointing out this difference. And this national coalition is pointing out the fact that you cannot equate those two things. And that's why when I say there's a suspect, it's not a suspect class, that's what I'm referring to. So I hope you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that there haven't been individual cases where regrettably LGBT people have been, treated poorly or discriminated against, and that should not happen. But it doesn't rise to the level of requiring the types of interventions or the things that they're asking for here. Now, I also find it interesting that Justin did not address this open door issue that I raised. That this is not going to end with same-sex couples. This will not end. That there will be multiple virgins. Why can't 5 people get married then? Why should the number be only 2? If the people love each other, I mean, you could see the same arguments. Then why shouldn't they be allowed to get married as a group of people? And on and on and on. And, the whole slippery slope argument. But it is really true here. And I would argue that it's not, it's clear that that is a problem. It's not going to end with just same-sex couples. If anything goes, and all you have to do is say you love each other, and you're sincere about that, then marriage, in effect, becomes meaningless. Because anything could be a marriage. And so I think that's part of the concern that we're bringing up here. Now, as to the issue, the last main point I wanted to get to, this issue of the infertile couple, or somebody who's sterile, that sort of thing, or they choose not to have children. There are couples who, husbands and wives who get married and choose not to have kids. Now, again, it's a very small percentage of all of the couples out there, but it does happen. But again, even in those marriages, it's still a man and a woman being unified in a union in the same way. The definition doesn't change. Infertility is not an impediment to that relationship. And it's not an impediment to marriage. It never has been. Marriage is an end in itself. It is a good thing. And it's worthwhile for its own sake, for the reasons I gave, for the public policy reasons that help support our culture and society. These marriages, even if childless, still contribute to the common good and welfare of society. Everybody benefits from a healthy marriage, traditional marriage culture. And I like to end with this. The law is the great teacher. Okay? People say, we shouldn't legislate morality. I'm sure a lot of you in here have heard that. You can't legislate morality. Sounds good on its face, doesn't it? Until you start looking at our laws. I'd invite you to email me with any law that you could find that doesn't have a moral component to it. Our whole criminal law is a moral code. It's wrong to kill. It's wrong to steal. We pass laws against it. It's wrong to commit child abuse, those sorts of things. They're moral decisions. We pass environmental laws. We pass laws for climate change and global warming. Why? Because moral decisions are being made all the time. I dare say there's not a law that's ever been passed that doesn't have a moral component to it. So the question is not, are we going to legislate morality? Morality gets legislated, folks. Okay? The question is, whose morality is being legislated and how is it being worked out through our culture and through our society? And the law is the great teacher. And we have a law in place that puts up an ideal and that has been proven over thousands of years to be effective and best for children and cultures and societies. And we shouldn't just willy-nilly throw that out. When there are other means and other methods for same-sex couples or anyone else to get legal protections and the other things, which they are entitled and they should be able to get. And they can do through contract. And they do get through benefits at work and other things right now. Practically every Fortune 500 company now provides benefits for same-sex couples and all sorts of things. So a lot of these benefits that they're talking about can be handled in other ways. Current marriage laws communicate a message about what marriage is as a moral reality. And there's no other way to get around that, folks. The law teaches that. And so therefore the state has an obligation to get this right and to get the message right. And it's not saying anything negative against anybody else. You know, everybody is equal under the law, man and woman can get married. Okay? That's the tradition, that's the current definition in our laws, and that's what should be upheld for the sake of all people who might in the future want to enter into marriage. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both again for very impressive